announcing today a major show of military force in the region.
Before dawn breaks over the Caribbean, the sea looks calm. Too calm. Because beneath that smooth horizon, something is shifting. Warships are moving. Radars are lit. Orders are being whispered, not shouted. And the world, whether it realizes it or not, is holding its breath. For weeks, tensions between Venezuela and the United States have been quietly climbing. Official statements speak the language of diplomacy, but fleets tell a different story. An aircraft carrier strike group has entered the region, taking up a position that is impossible to misunderstand. This is not a routine patrol. This is a message written in steel and jet fuel. What happens when political pressure meets open water? History gives us a warning. The sea is often where conflicts stop being theoretical. One miscalculation. One radar contact misread. One aircraft flying a little too close. Naval confrontations don't need declarations of war to turn deadly. They only need seconds. In this scenario, both sides claim they are acting defensively. Venezuela frames the movement of its naval and air assets as protection of sovereignty. The United States insists its presence guarantees freedom of navigation. These phrases sound familiar, almost harmless. But behind them lies a dangerous reality. Heavily armed ships operating within striking distance of each other, surrounded by contested airspace and political mistrust. Imagine a single night at sea. Electronic warfare systems hum as commanders test each other's limits. Surveillance aircraft circle overhead. A warning is issued, then another. Suddenly, a maneuver meant to intimidate is interpreted as an attack preparation. Missiles are locked, not launched, but locked. In modern naval warfare, that alone can decide the next move. This is not about a single battle. It's about what a naval clash would represent. A fight at sea would instantly escalate a regional standoff into a global crisis. Shipping lanes could be disrupted. Energy markets would react within minutes. Allies would be forced to choose sides, or at least explain why they refuse to. The world has seen this pattern before, and it never stays contained. What makes this moment especially dangerous is the illusion of control. Advanced technology creates confidence, better sensors, faster aircraft, smarter missiles. But technology doesn't eliminate fear, pride, or political pressure. In fact, it often compresses decision-making into narrower windows, where hesitation looks like weakness and restraint looks like defeat. This video is not about predicting the future. It's about understanding how close the present can drift toward it, how a calm sea can hide a storm, how a naval deployment can become a spark, and how, in an interconnected world, a confrontation far from most people's lives can still shape their future. Because when warships face each other at sea, it's never just about the ships. It's about the world watching and waiting to see who blinks first. Global tension rarely explodes without warning. More often, it accumulates quietly, layer by layer, until even a minor incident feels capable of tipping the balance. That is the atmosphere surrounding the current standoff between Venezuela and the United States, an atmosphere thick with suspicion, strategic signaling, and global unease. Officially, there is no war, no declared crisis, no emergency summits filling headlines every day. Unofficially, diplomats, analysts, and military planners describe the situation with a single phrase heard more and more often behind closed doors. The world is on edge. The broader international context makes this tension especially volatile. Over the past decade, global politics has shifted away from stable blocs toward a fragmented system of regional power struggles. Conflicts that once remained local now ripple outward almost instantly, affecting energy markets, shipping routes, and political alliances. In this environment, even a regional confrontation in the Caribbean basin is no longer peripheral. It is part of a larger pattern of instability that stretches from Eastern Europe to the South China Sea. Relations between Washington and Caracas have been strained for years, marked by sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and repeated accusations of interference. What is different now is the military dimension. In recent months, both sides have increased their operational tempo. The United States has publicly emphasized routine naval patrols and joint exercises with regional partners, framing them as standard commitments to security and freedom of navigation. Venezuela, meanwhile, has described these same movements as deliberate provocations, arguing that they represent psychological pressure backed by overwhelming force. According to regional observers, maritime activity in the area has increased noticeably. Commercial captains report more frequent encounters with naval vessels, while aviation tracking data shows a rise in reconnaissance flights over international waters. None of this is unprecedented, but the density and timing are raising eyebrows. A senior Latin American security official, speaking anonymously, recently claimed that the margin for misunderstanding is smaller than it has been in years. While such statements cannot be independently verified, they reflect a growing sense that restraint is being tested. Part of the tension stems from the symbolic weight of naval power. Warships do not simply patrol, they communicate. An aircraft carrier appearing on the horizon is a strategic statement that requires no translation. Analysts point out that naval deployments are often used precisely because they fall short of outright aggression while still applying maximum pressure. This ambiguity is intentional, but it also creates risk. When both sides operate in close proximity, intent becomes harder to interpret and harder to trust. There are also internal pressures at play. Venezuela faces ongoing economic hardship and political strain, making sovereignty and resistance powerful domestic narratives. Demonstrating resolve against an external power can rally internal support, even if the actual confrontation remains limited. On the other side, the United States must balance deterrence with caution, signaling strength to allies without becoming trapped in an unintended escalation. That balance is delicate, and history shows it can fail. Adding to the uncertainty are reports, unconfirmed but persistent, of emergency communication drills conducted by regional governments in recent weeks. While officials deny any connection to the current situation, the timing has fueled speculation that contingency planning is accelerating. Even if these reports exaggerate the reality, their circulation alone contributes to the psychological pressure surrounding the standoff. This is why the opening phase of the crisis matters so much. Before any shot is fired, before any ship is damaged, the global environment is already being shaped by anticipation. Markets react to rumors, governments prepare statements they hope never to release, and military commanders rehearse scenarios they pray remain hypothetical. The sea may look calm, but the geopolitical waters are anything but. In moments like this, history reminds us that the most dangerous phase of a conflict is often the one where everyone insists nothing is happening, right up until it does. In modern geopolitics, the sea is rarely just water. It is space, leverage, and pressure all at once. And in the current standoff between Venezuela and the United States, maritime space has become the most sensitive and most dangerous arena. Unlike land borders, which are fixed and clearly defined, the ocean allows power to move, appear, disappear, and reappear without crossing a single recognized line. That flexibility is precisely what makes it strategically valuable and inherently unstable. The Caribbean and adjacent waters have long served as a critical corridor for global commerce. Energy shipments, container traffic, and regional trade all flow through sea lanes that cannot simply be rerouted without consequences. Any perception of risk in these waters immediately raises insurance costs, alters shipping schedules, and sends signals to global markets. This is why naval movements here attract far more attention than comparable deployments elsewhere. A single destroyer altering course can generate speculation far beyond its actual combat capability. From a strategic standpoint, maritime pressure offers an ideal tool for confrontation without commitment. Naval forces can enforce presence without occupation, surveillance without invasion, deterrence without declarations. This gray zone is where modern power competition thrives. The United States has relied on naval dominance for decades as a means of shaping behavior while avoiding open conflict. Venezuela, aware of this imbalance, views the sea not just as a defensive buffer, but as the front line where sovereignty is tested most visibly. Control of the maritime environment also means control of information. Warships and patrol aircraft gather intelligence constantly, mapping radar signatures, monitoring communications, and tracking response times. Even routine patrols serve a dual purpose. They reassure allies while quietly measuring adversaries. According to several naval analysts, recent weeks have seen an unusual concentration of surveillance activity, suggesting that both sides are attempting to refine their understanding of each other's thresholds. Official sources dismiss these assessments as speculation, but the patterns are difficult to ignore. There is also a psychological dimension unique to naval confrontation. Ships operate in isolation, often far from public view, where decisions fall on a handful of commanders with limited time and incomplete information. Unlike diplomatic negotiations, which unfold slowly and visibly, maritime encounters compress risk into moments. A maneuver meant as a warning can be interpreted as a prelude to attack. A radar lock can feel indistinguishable from an imminent strike. These ambiguities are not accidents. They are built into naval signaling, and they magnify the stakes. Venezuela's coastline, stretching along key maritime routes, gives it symbolic and practical reasons to emphasize naval defense. Domestic messaging increasingly frames the sea as the last line of resistance against external coercion. State media has highlighted naval exercises and port inspections, portraying them as evidence of readiness and resolve. Some reports even claim the temporary activation of coastal monitoring systems beyond their usual operational cycles, though independent confirmation is lacking. Whether exaggerated or not, such narratives feed a perception of rising alertness. For the United States, the strategic value of the sea lies in mobility and reach. An aircraft carrier or amphibious group can influence events hundreds of miles inland without ever entering territorial waters. This ability to project power while remaining legally outside national borders is central to American naval doctrine. Yet it also creates friction, as actions considered lawful by one side are perceived as threatening by the other. International law may permit presence, but politics defines interpretation. What makes the maritime domain especially dangerous is that escalation at sea often precedes escalation everywhere else. Historically, naval incidents have acted as catalysts rather than endpoints. A collision, an exchange of warning fire, or even an aggressive interception can rapidly force political leaders into hardened positions. Backing down becomes harder once ships are already deployed and crews are already committed. In this context, the sea is not merely a backdrop to geopolitical tension. It is the mechanism through which that tension is tested. It allows both sides to apply pressure while telling themselves they remain in control. But history suggests that control at sea is often an illusion. The very qualities that make maritime power attractive, speed, ambiguity, reach, are the same qualities that can turn a calculated signal into an uncontrollable crisis. Insurance premiums would spike, and shipping companies would begin rerouting vessels, reinforcing the perception of crisis regardless of its actual scale. Perhaps the most dangerous aspect of such a confrontation is the pressure it creates to escalate rather than de-escalate. Once ships are damaged or personnel injured, restraint becomes politically costly. Calls for retaliation grow louder, framed as defense of national honor or protection of international norms. Even leaders inclined toward caution may find their options limited by public expectation and alliance commitments. History shows that conflicts often expand not because they are planned, but because they are difficult to stop once they begin. This is where the broader risk becomes clear. A naval clash between these forces would not remain an isolated event. It would serve as a catalyst, reshaping calculations far beyond the region. Other powers would study the response, assessing credibility and resolve. Military postures elsewhere might harden in anticipation of spillover effects. What began as a localized maritime confrontation could contribute to a wider atmosphere of confrontation, reinforcing the sense that global stability is eroding. Yet it is important to note that this outcome is not inevitable. The same visibility that makes naval power dangerous also creates opportunities for restraint. Every movement is observed, every decision weighed by multiple actors. Communication channels, though strained, still exist. The knowledge that escalation carries global consequences can act as a brake, even in moments of intense pressure. The question is whether that brake holds when tested by fatigue, pride, and fear. As discussed earlier, the sea offers both flexibility and risk. In the current situation, it is the stage on which strength is displayed and limits are probed. Demonstrations of force, hypothetical clashes, and the threat of escalation are all part of a single continuum, one that feeds on uncertainty. The world watches not because it expects war, but because it understands how quickly signaling can turn into confrontation. In that uncertainty lies the real danger, not in what has happened yet, but in how easily the next step could be taken, and how hard it might be to reverse once it is. The consequences of a naval confrontation, even a limited one, would extend far beyond the waters where it occurred. As mentioned earlier, the mere anticipation of conflict already shapes behavior, but an actual incident would harden those effects into reality. The first and most immediate impact would be psychological. Governments, markets, and populations respond not only to facts, but to perceived direction. A clash at sea would signal that restraint has failed, and that signal would travel faster than any official explanation. For the United States, the aftermath would involve a delicate recalibration of global posture. Allies would look for reassurance that commitments remain firm, while rivals would search for signs of hesitation or overreach. Even a measured response would be scrutinized as either weakness or provocation, depending on the observer. Internally, political debate would sharpen, with pressure to justify actions already taken and anticipate those that may follow. History suggests that once military force is used, even indirectly, the space for purely diplomatic solutions narrows dramatically. For Venezuela, the consequences would be equally complex. Domestically, a confrontation could strengthen narratives of resistance and sovereignty, at least in the short term. Externally, however, the costs would mount quickly. Diplomatic isolation could deepen, financial channels could tighten further, and regional partners might quietly distance themselves to avoid secondary fallout. Some analysts speculate that emergency economic measures would be required almost immediately to stabilize key sectors, though officials would likely frame such steps as precautionary rather than reactive. Beyond the two principal actors, the regional impact would be significant. Neighboring states, even those not directly involved, would be forced to reassess their security assumptions. Naval and air forces across the region might increase readiness levels, not because war is expected, but because uncertainty demands preparation. Multinational organizations would issue statements calling for restraint, while privately urging de-escalation through back channels. These gestures may appear symbolic, but symbolism matters when trust is in short supply. The global economy would feel the shock in more subtle but persistent ways. As noted earlier, markets are sensitive to risk, and a confirmed naval incident would reprice that risk almost instantly. Energy futures could spike on speculation alone, shipping insurers might revise coverage terms overnight, and investment decisions unrelated to the region could be postponed amid broader uncertainty. Even if no further escalation occurs, the perception of instability would linger, embedding itself into forecasts and strategies. Perhaps the most lasting consequence would be strategic rather than immediate. A confrontation at sea would become a reference point, cited in future crises as evidence of how quickly situations can deteriorate. Military doctrines would be reviewed, communication protocols adjusted, and assumptions rewritten. Some reports might even claim that certain navies began testing new engagement rules shortly after the incident, though such claims would be difficult to verify. What is certain is that the episode would reshape expectations. In the end, the greatest cost may be intangible. Each crisis that pushes the world closer to open conflict erodes confidence in the systems designed to prevent it. As discussed earlier, escalation is not always a deliberate choice. Sometimes it is the accumulation of moments where restraint gives way to momentum. A single naval clash would not define the future, but it would narrow it, reminding the world how fragile stability can be and how easily it can be lost.